Okay, can you see me okay, Naila? Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It gives me great pleasure to introduce these next two speakers. We're at the end of our conference, and we saved the best for last. And so I'm not going to go into the details of their bios because you can read it for yourselves. But because I'm personal close friends of these two speakers, I imposed myself to introduce them. And I'll just tell you, when I think of chaplains, Islamic chaplains, in terms of like the history of chaplaincy, which, you know, I've always said, I've been involved in Islamic chaplaincy and collaborating with Islamic chaplains for over 10 years now. And the way I think conceptualize it is that you know, they're the professionals where kind of combining religious authority and professionalization of services. And traditionally, you know, the Islamic chaplains was kind of the person giving da'wah in the prisons and the hospitals, and that was kind of the chaplaincy 1.0. Now we have you know, Imam Bilal Ansari is chaplain 2.0, and he has the fancy titles of, you know, co-director of Islamic chaplaincy. He is an MDiv. He's assistant vice president at Williams and Mary for campus engagement. But what's important for you to know in this context is his community leadership and his experience in chaplaincy, in both in the prisons and the hospitals, in the university. I'm always forgetting one. What's the last one? Prison, chaplaincy, hospital, military. So Bilal has all those type of experiences. And he's going to bring that to us in addition to that theological expertise. So Bilal is Islamic chaplaincy 2.0. Sondos is chaplaincy 3.0. She's a board certified Islamic chaplain from Southern California. Already, and out of the chaplains I've encountered, she's the most psychologically minded I've had the pleasure of working with. And so it's a pleasure to have them here both. You know, we're going to learn from them about, and this is an important collaboration as mental health professionals we need to continue to foster and cultivate. And so I look forward to both your talks. I think we gave age first, right? Bilal's going first. Okay. I will put my microphone.
I actually thought it was like beauty first, you know. But you know, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah. We want to begin with giving praise to God the Most High, and for His gift of the Prophet Muhammad. You know, prayers and peace, you know, be upon him. I also want to thank everybody who is in attendance coming today. I am also a board member of the Institute of Muslim Mental Health, and so as a board member, I want to thank you for the past 2 days of being here, being present, and please give in whatever way you can. All right, so I've done my job, Hamada. Okay, no, so all right, so I just want to share my screen here, and if I may. So today I've been tasked with giving a talk about Islamic theology and emotional well-being. I want to center that conversation first with a case, with a story, with a narrative. And it's going to frame the rest of the things that I have to share. So I want us to imagine a young girl growing up in like Guyana, or South America, who, because of her mother's addiction to drugs, she became an instrument of the like drug lords, and they used her from early childhood, you know, her body, until later in life. She became a mule. They transported drugs through her body across the lines, from state to state, from nation to nation. And just imagine looking at and experiencing life through this young girl's eyes. And in South America, the only thing that she saw that was a little bit of a control that women had of access, you know, to their body, was Muslim women fully dressed, that she would see in South America, that she would hold a place in her heart. And this comes up later in her story. Because early in her 20s, she was caught in Miami, and the United States government wanted to get the drug lords that they knew were using her. So they said, if you tell on these drug lords, we will shorten your sentence, and all you need to is give up these names. But she knew doing that, her mother would die and her whole family would die, and so she had to keep that. And so the United States gave her life in prison. And in her first week of prison, she sought out the Muslims, because in prison she wanted to take back control of her body. And so she wanted to put on the hijab and a gown because she grew, again, in the eyes of a child, she saw the only women in her neighborhood that had control of their bodies were Muslim women. And so she converted to Islam in prison. And then the prison told her that she could not be photographed. She could not wear like a jibab. She could not wear like a jilbab. She had to wear pants. And she fought, for that. And she fought even more to have more control of her body, because she fought for the right to not to be like a gendered searched, pat searched. Imagine the prison had to hire women. That's what she fought for. And all the way to the Supreme Court. And one other thing that she fought for that brought me, her and I, for me to have the privilege of serving her, was she fought for the right for Muslim women in prison to have access to a Muslim religious leader trained to come in and do a Jummah like the Muslim males. She fought for the right for Jummah services, for prayer in group, like the Muslim males. And she won all four of those rights, mashallah. So she's walking around with a badge, with her scarf on now, proud of her Muslim identity. She's now able to wear like a jilbab proudly, and they actually hired women to actually work in a women's prison. Imagine that. She actually transformed the environment by her fight. And I responded to her plea. But for 7 years, no Muslim male would respond, because going into a Muslim women's prison on a Friday, you are in violation of Islamic law and Islamic theology. You need, minimally in all law schools, at least one Muslim male. Maleness is a requirement for Jummah's validation. And in my law school, you need at least 40 like residents there. But how are we taking care of the emotional well-being of the Muslim women? How are we living up to the hadith that do not prohibit Allah's maidservants from the house of Allah, that our beloved Prophet Muhammad has commended us? And so on that authority, I took the contract. I left my male prison. The reason why they were able to contact me, because I didn't hear about this contract for years, but I was fighting on my compound, was both a male prison and also like a women's prison. And I've been fighting for years for the Muslim women to have the same access that males had. And I was fighting, and they fought me back. They suspended me for a week without pay. They would go in my office and do nasty things. They made it very hard on me, but it made the newspaper. And so the Yale Law School, who was fighting this case for this Muslim woman in prison, the Yale Law School was fighting this case, read about my case in the newspaper. Wait a minute, there's this black man, who's fighting for the rights of Muslim women. Let's ask him. So they asked me. And so I gave up my job, my state job with retirement, all that stuff, to go serve 2 hours a week to establish a precedent. This precedent was very, very important and near and dear to my heart. And now Muslim women chaplains are now hired and being hired within the prison, within the federal system. And so after 2 years of establishing this, now that problem no longer exists. Now Muslim women chaplains can also serve as chaplains and be hired within the a federal prison. And so that was a resistance on my part and a resistance on her part, but it was our spiritual struggle for taking care of the emotional well-being of the Muslim women. And so this is where I want to start in the framing. And so I am now talking about Islamic theology, not as a creedal theology, but more as a practical or a pastoral theology. And so it is more about the way of life, the way that life is inhabited. It's an acquired worldview. It's a theological view of the world that causes you to act a certain way, to have a conduct in a certain way based on a theological worldview. It moves you to respond internally. It is a way in which your particular background causes you to react in the world. And historically, for the Muslims, we have a transcendent spirituality. So emotional well-being is sought after in loftiness and isolation and being away from the world and not engaging in the world. So that makes up 90% of our tradition, of our literature. So there's very little on what Dr. Sherman Jackson talks about, which is more when he talks about an imminent spirituality, an imminent way of care, of being able to reach God that validates resistance as a spiritual activity. It is actually a necessary psychological energy that infuses and valorizes the fending off of evil forces that assail the heart. And this is our tradition. When you reflect, as I reflect as a Black male, growing up, seeing my Black mother is the walking example of imminent spirituality, of resistance every day. Her resistance was my means of God, seeing her struggle every day. And it energized me to fight for the same thing that I wanted in my life. And so in Islam, I was looking for something that spoke to the emotional well-being of the African-American struggle here, because I was serving in a prison context. So what does it mean to affirm the emotional well-being? Can you affirm that emotional well-being, and can it reside in the activity of walking with as opposed to ascending to? So is it possible? Is there a sense of well-being through the theological lens that gives support to this idea of walking with as opposed to ascending to God? Especially when you have people whose whole life, their bodies and their minds and their beings were not in their control. When they're suffering through trauma, through anxiety, they have fear. How do you walk with individuals like that when they're in climates as hostile as prisons? How do you hold up an umbrella? How do you let them shine in their authentic, beautiful selves that they are, but cause them for some comfort and some shade from the environment? And I offer that it is an imminent means of theology. It's not the transcendent, but more of a lived experience. And this is found in our Quranic narrative, when you have this kind of juxtaposition within America of, you can have girls at the same age who want to grow up being princesses, who wear the same princess outfits, who dream of holding flowers and running in fields. But in some realities, that is a reality. But in others, you're surrounded by flowers, but they're rose petals that you're laying on the ground at vigils for the death of George Floyd, where your your reality on how you see heaven and earth looks different in your history, your spiritual history, and that needs to be attended to when you're a chaplain caring for somebody. But this verse in the Quran reminds us that God heard similarly Mujadala, the one who pleaded. And so if you look at that story, it is exactly God saying this in the 7th, chapter. Like, do you not see that Allah knows whatever is in the heavens and and whatever's in the earth? If there's 3 that converse privately, He is the 4th. If 5, then He's the 6th. Whether fewer or more, and this is the point, He is with them wherever they may be. Then on the day of judgment, He will inform them on what they have done. Surely Allah is perfect in knowledge of all things. So this affirms that there is this dual existence. There is this dual way of being with God at the same time ascending to God. I'm not negating the ascension to God, but I'm saying that for African Americans or those who are in marginalized identities, it must begin with the immanent spirituality. Another thing that affirms this and validates and valorizes this struggle is the story of Yusuf, which Allah describes as the most beautiful narrative. And in that narrative, the dua in that narrative goes, "My Lord, I would rather be in jail than do what they invite me to. And if you do not turn their cunning away from me, I might yield to them and fall into ignorance." And so there's a validation of sometimes you may be in an environment, a hostile you may be in a struggle, a toil, but there is actually a means of being with God, the ma'iyah. Allah says in the Quran that His ma'iyah, He is with those who patiently struggle through these times. And so this is what I wanted to remind us of, that in the case study, that you will hear that the resistance was a means towards God, and that validation of listening to, responding to the emotional well-being, whether male or female, whether privileged or marginalized. Like Allah says in the Quran, righteousness is not this or that, not in the east or the west, it's not in, but those, the poor, it goes to the rich or the poor, but those who give up what they love and serve. And this is what this immanent like spirituality is all about. It's this necessary psychological energy that is in the valorization of fending off evil forces that assail the heart. And there's spiritual like assessment models that a chaplain learns, that when it is appropriate to use models and methods of ascension, when you interpret states and what's excessive and what's less than. But my model for the prison ministry are those who you may have longer time with. You lower the structures and you just walk with them. You just be with them. You just have hudur. You be present for those who are gaib, who are absent from the society, who are cut off from the affairs, who are not absorbed in their senses, who are just struggling with their hearts to be present with their Lord, who are remembering the eternal awards for their struggles, who are striving to ward off being punished, and whose presence with God is the degree of their absence from everything else. And this is why I wanted to share the story of the Muslim women in prison. And I close and I open it up for question, because emotional well-being is often found in places where it's not where you have to ascend to, but it's the most deep forms of resistance. Okay, peace.
Okay, so before we go to questions, let's give Sondos a chance to share, and then we'll go from there. Okay?
Sure, we can do that. All right, let me share my screen. I could listen to Bilal preach all day, inshallah. Okay. Is this good? Can you see my slide? Okay. All right. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Like my colleague Bilal, I'd like to open with a word of gratitude, first and foremost to Allah Ta'ala, and then the conference organizers. I can't imagine the hours of effort that you've all put in to make this as seamless and smooth and beneficial to all of us in attendance, and to all of the attendees for taking time out of your weekend to be here with us and to learn together and hopefully explore together. As Dr. Hamada mentioned in the beginning, I serve as a hospital chaplain in Southern California, and I've also, within the past year and a half or so, joined a third space community here, a Muslim organization, where I also do some community chaplaincy through office hours for the local Muslim community. And we can imagine that in this past year, through both of those avenues, whether in the hospital or through the community, this idea of emotional well-being is a topic that has come out and surfaced pretty much in every visit. And really, we know that research suggests that religion and spirituality are one of the top coping strategies and mechanisms that people really dip into in times of crisis. And I personally have seen that manifest for Muslims and non-Muslims. In the hospital, I serve mostly non-Muslims, and it's been a learning experience for me to be able to hear the ways in which their faith and their belief systems and their religion and their spirituality really informs the way that they see the world and the way that they navigate through the crises that they are facing. And so what this has done actually is, in the past year for myself, holding my own challenges and then also holding, walking alongside other people in theirs, has really encouraged me to go back to my faith tradition, to my Islamic theology, and dig deeper into what it means to use that theology and use that spirituality and use that connection in a way that will enhance my own emotional well-being, so that I can be fully present and be non-anxious presence for other people, as well as be able to help other people navigate the tools that are at our disposal in this beautiful tradition of Islam. And really what I found has blown me away, really, really has blown me away, whether it's from the Quran or from the Surah and the practices of our beloved Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So I hope to bring a taste of that here today, inshallah. And that's why I named this presentation, Our Tradition is One of Healing, because really everything goes back to that, whether it's spiritual, emotional, physical, it's all about healing itself. So when I talk about emotional well-being today, I'm going to try and cover, let me see, actually, get my timer going too. I'm going to try and cover these 5 points. Healthy expression of emotions through an Islamic framework, healthy expression of emotions, what that looks like, management of thoughts, a healthy sense of self-worth, utilization of our healing practices and how we do that, and sustaining self-care and support. When we talk about emotional well-being, those who exhibit high emotional well-being exhibit resilience in the face of hardship. They're able to manage their stress levels. They're able to control or maintain some semblance of control over their thoughts, which in turn affect their emotions. So we're going to explore today, inshallah, the practices and beliefs from our Islamic framework that we can use to enhance our own emotional well-being. So the first point is expressing emotions. And I don't need to tell you guys this, you know this very well, that emotions that surface play a really important role, almost like a God-given internal security system, that when emotions surface, it's to alert us there's something off in our being, in our mind, body, or spirit. And it's telling us, hey, pay attention, there's something off here, there's a threat, or there's something that's blocking us or providing a barrier to our fitrah, to our whole self. And I look back to the story of Adam alayhi salam, where Allah Ta'ala had ennobled him and gave him this ability to know the names of all things. And in that, we know that there's a dignity, but there's also a power. There's also a power in the ability to name things. So when we feel these emotions surfacing, to be able to give name to them, to be able to identify them and move there towards the source, identifying the source. And we'll talk a little bit about how that may work. But before I do that, I want to talk about the expression of emotion in Islam. And this is something that was very touching and important for me to read in the seerah of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because for chaplains especially, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was deemed by Allah or nicknamed by Allah as rahmatan lil alameen, mercy to all of creation, mercy to all of humankind. What did that mean? And to me, his mercy really manifested in his vulnerability and his authenticity. And the way that he really demonstrated that was the way that he expressed emotion freely. So I learned first and foremost in my pastoral caregiving and my spiritual caregiving and being authentic and real with people in their moments of realness. The Prophet's example, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, really informs that. So we know from the seerah that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a very emotionally expressive man. He used to cry when he'd hear especially touching verses from the Quran. And even when there was poetry that was recited that would really touch his heart, he would cry freely from it. He was one who would show affection to his daughters and to children freely. He would kiss them on their head. He would have them come and be in his lap or sit next to them. We know the famous story of him doing sujood and his grandchildren playing on top of him. And this was an action or actions that were done in a culture that was not very expressive or did not hold that up, especially for men. And I think it's the same today. And even when the Prophet ﷺ lost his infant son, Ibrahim, he was crying so much so that the companions asked him, "Oh, Prophet, you're crying too, but this is something that you do." And he said that tears are a mercy. Tears are a mercy. So when you think about a chaplain colleague of mine gave me a beautiful term for this, where she asked me, what is our theology of tears? And really, this is what informs it. Our tears are a mercy, because that is what the Prophet ﷺ taught us. When even faced with beauty, the Prophet ﷺ acknowledged it, and he wept at it. Let me see. There's an entire year of his life, an entire segment of the seerah of his story, his life story, that's called the year of sadness. An entire year set aside that is meant of grieving and mourning and loss. And lastly, the Prophet encouraged us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to speak love. He said in the hadith, when someone loves their brother, let them tell them that they love them. And this applies to sisters too as well. So he wanted and encouraged people to verbalize their love. Why is this really important for us to know? For me, this is important because, like I mentioned in the beginning, this shows us how the Prophet ﷺ was authentic in the moment. He was not afraid to show and express his emotions. And in fact, we know that expression of emotions is part of the healing process. That to brush that under the rug or to refrain from expressing it is actually detrimental somatically and physiologically to our bodies. To be able to let that go is something that is healing for ourselves. And one example that I have from this in my own experience at the hospital, the other advantage, which connects to this story, is that it also gives people permission to be themselves and to emote if they need to. So, which brings me to my story that at the hospital, there was a physician who asked to sit with me for a consult because he was going through a crisis of his own in his personal life. And when he began to talk about it and discuss it, he began to cry. He started to cry. And the way that he was talking about it really touched something in my heart, because I had had an experience similar to what he was talking about, where his level of emotion reminded me of the state that I was in when I was in that spot myself. And I began to cry and I couldn't help it. Tears came to my eyes. And I felt really bad in the moment to think like, oh my goodness, I don't want to distract from his pain and his story. This is his moment right now, not mine. And so I apologized for my tears, which is something I always tell care seekers they never have to do. And yet here I was doing it. And he just paused and looked at me and he said, very gratefully, he said, no, don't apologize. Your tears remind me that you're human too. In other words, it was no longer like, here I am, the chaplain who has everything figured out and solve all your problems, but it's rather, I'm a human being and I experience pain too, and we can meet and connect in this space. And that's where I see the Prophet ﷺ, where his emotional intelligence and the power of that came from. And then lastly, tears in the Quran. The Quran highlights those believers and those people who shed tears upon hearing the recitation of the truth, or crying in repentance, and from their love for and awe for Allah. So we see that the expression of emotion in Islam theologically is something that's uplifted, that is seen as a positive, merciful thing. So we talk about emotions, and we can't talk about emotions without also talking about our thoughts. And recently, I was able to make this beautiful connection between our practices in Islam of Muraqaba and Muhasaba, or self-observation and like a self-assessment or self-accountability. So in clinical pastoral education, CPE, which is like on the field training for chaplains that we have to do in the hospital, we have the supervisor, we have peers, we have a practice called the verbatim, where I believe it's similar to maybe what counselors and therapists go to, where you have to actually submit verbatim a conversation that you have with a patient or a client. And you have to also track not only the words, but also from the chaplain's point of view, the emotions that surface for oneself, and also the thoughts that are coming to mind. And so what we do is when we, somebody's presenting the verbatim to the group, we're picking that apart. And we're saying, why did you say this? And I see that you were thinking this, and I wonder if there was a connection that prompted you to then say this, or to do this, or to react in this way. A very like studious method of looking at a conversation. And I look at Muraqaba and Muhasaba in that way, in almost like doing a self-verbatim, where when maybe we can't do it in the moment, we should train ourselves to be able to do that. But when we have a conversation, or when emotion surfaces for us, to really pause, to take that moment and say, what is going on with me internally? Be able to capture our thoughts and our emotions, name them as we talked about, right? And figure out what we need to do and where we need to move from there. Where is that coming from? Is that my lower self that's informing it? Is there a jealousy? Is there an anger? Is there something that's coming up that I need to figure out because there's a wound that's still open there and hasn't been healed? And what do I need to do to heal that? Right? There's a whole conversation that literally, I catch myself sometimes in the parking lot in the hospital talking to myself out loud, which people probably think I'm a little bit insane. But it's really, really helpful to be able to have that conversation with oneself. And this is a practice that in Islam, our saints and sages really recommended for us to do. So to me, this captures the real meaning of mindfulness. And Chaplain Bilal also talked about this idea of seclusion and isolation as part of our tradition, to be able to really sit with ourselves, to sit in the discomfort, to sit in the sadness, to sit in the emotion. Because as we know, the famous saying, whoever knows oneself knows their Lord. To be able to know our weaknesses, know our strengths, know how we want to connect and how we need to connect ultimately, is going to enhance, inshallah, our connection with Rabbil Alameen. When we're talking about thoughts, I also have to bring up this idea of the reframe, which is an intervention that chaplains also use to be able to provide a care seeker or client with just a slightly different perspective theologically. This is one of my favorite reframes from our beautiful saint, Rabia al-Adawiyya, when she's speaking to the angel of death, and she's writing this. She says, the angel of death says, I am the murderer of joy, the widower of wives, the orphaner of children. And Rabia replied, why always run yourself down? Why not say instead, I am he who brings friend and friend together? Capital F, friend, meaning Allah Ta'ala, of course, God. So this being able to shift one's perspective, and this idea of the negative thoughts, right, that we run ourselves into, this pattern that we might find ourselves in, to find a different theological angle or bend wherein we can then work from a place of optimism and hope and beauty, actually, right, beauty. Another example of a reframe, a story that I love that my sheikh shared, where he said, he shared about a sheikh, another student who came to a sheikh talking to him and crying because he had a very heavy problem, very heavy situation, and a heavy test in his own life. And the sheikh advised him and said, here's what you need to do. And the man left. And then one day he comes back and he's really happy. And he's like, oh my gosh, sheikh, that test that we were talking about completely passed. It's gone. It's over. And it's like this wonderful thing. And then the sheikh didn't hear from the man. And the man comes back a third time. And he's looking so despondent. And he tells his sheikh, the same problem that I just endured and I just passed through has come back. Why is this happening to me? And the sheikh replied, Alhamdulillah, that it's the same problem and not a different one, because now you know how to solve it. SubhanAllah, the way that our spiritual ancestors and our saints and our sages have taken the hardships and difficulties and be able to reframe them and give a different way of thinking about it that can be more conducive to a better emotional well-being, inshallah. And on that note, we learn also that we have in our Islamic theology this idea of Ahlul Dhikr, or of those who are so immersed in the remembrance and the presence of Allah that they are living in the present. And when we talk about positive well-being, it comes up or it surfaces that one is mindful of where they are in that moment of the present. They're neither grieving over what happened in the past, nor are they anxious and worried and fearful about the future. What is in front of them right now is all that matters. And this is in our theology. In the Quran, in chapter 10, verse 62, the ayah says, behold, verily no fear shall be upon the friends of God, nor shall they grieve. And some of the commentators of the Quran talk about this idea of ibn al-waqt, or child of the moment, the one who lives in the present, where when we reach that station, and we all can reach it, by the way, this is not an exclusive station for like just some people who just are born with it. We all have the potential to be these friends of Allah, these awliya, to train ourselves to be in the moment where we're not worrying about the past nor about the future. There's no anxiousness there. And our beloved Prophet Muhammad in a hadith said, strive for that which will benefit you, seek the help of Allah, and do not feel helpless. If anything befalls you, do not say, if only I had done such and such, but rather say Allah has decreed, and whatever he wills, he does, saying if opens the doors to Satan. So we see here that there's a direct connection between our thoughts and our positive and our negative coping and the way that we're dealing and coping with the situation. So we have positive coping in Islamic theology. I like to call this the growth mindset. So Chaplain Bilal touched upon this in his presentation as well. Is why do we have hardship? Why do we have challenges? Why do we have tests and tribulations? Clearly, this is a question that comes up often in the hospital. Why is there suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people, and so on? We know in the Quran that Allah promises us. He promises us that each one of us will be touched by difficulty, by loss, by fear, by hunger, but give glad tidings to the patient. And the Prophet Muhammad says, how wonderful the affair of the believer. Indeed, all of his affairs are good for him. There is for no one but the believer. If something good happens to him, he's grateful to Allah, which is good for him. And if something bad happens to him, he has patience, which is good for him. So we have this poll in the beginning of the session asking, how do you connect best to Allah? In our tradition, theologically, there are two ways, right? We go in from the door of gratitude when things are just seeming to go really, really well, alhamdulillah, and the blessings upon blessings that Allah, the most generous, has given us, that we show our connection and our appreciation through gratitude. And then there's the door of need, that when we're going through challenges, when we're going through hardship, that we enter through that door because we are in the most humble state in front of Rabbul Alameen and that we need him there. Either way, we know from our theology that we are tested, that the Quran, Allah Ta'ala tells us in the Quran that there are reasons and there's purpose for being tested and having challenges and hardship and suffering. And it's the idea of growth. It's this idea of deepening our connection to Allah, of knowing ourselves in a deeper way to be able to connect to him in a deeper way as well. One of my teachers reminds me that, we stumble to remain humble, that we make mistakes so that we can remember our state, our neediness, our fragility, our humility in front of the Most High, Allah Ta'ala. I won't spend too much time on this because I am already almost at time, but we have this idea of positive coping, of hope. Despair is not of those who believe. The believers are those who have hope in Allah Ta'ala. And we know the verse, the famous verse, with hardship comes ease, that there's a simultaneity there, that with the hardship is also moments of ease, inshallah. And I like to say our theology of healing is that Allah Ta'ala does not send us the tests without also sending us the resources to be able to overcome them. And it's a matter of finding those and utilizing them, inshallah. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ always spoke words of hope when he was visiting the sick. And this is something that I keep in mind as a hospital chaplain when I'm sitting with those, that we don't make the situation worse. Even if we can't fix it, even if we can't solve it, at the very least, our presence somehow will be able to translate into hope for the other person, however they want to make meaning of that, whether it's short-term or long-term hope. And finally, with positive coping from our theology, it's this beautiful practice of having and holding a good opinion of Allah Ta'ala. And this is just, it's probably tiny text, but just a sampling of the verses in the Quran that talk about Allah's mercy, talk about his compassion, talk about his love, his capaciousness, his generosity. We fail when it comes to mistakes, when it comes to tests, when it comes to tribulations. And sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong. But there's this idea of cultivating this emotional well-being where we just keep striving and we keep trying, we keep getting up day after day, morning after morning, and saying, I'm going to try again. Remember, the grief over the past and anxiousness over the future is just blocked out from those who are consistently remembering and trying to remember and having that dhikr and that hudud of Allah Ta'ala. One of my teachers framed the struggle of dunya in this world as chutes and ladders, right? Like, so you get your, you get your blessings and you think you're doing so well, and you're climbing the ladder, and something will come and just cut you down, all these steps, right? And there's this beauty in support and in community where we want to catch each other as we see one falling, say, hey, I'm going to grab you and we're going to stick together in this. I thought that was just a really beautiful image. I do not have time to go through all of these too much, but just to kind of flip through really quickly, cultivating a healthy emotional well-being through Islamic theology and framework also resides in this idea of our self-worth, seeing that Allah Ta'ala created us with a purpose, and he created you and he created me. How do I think of this? Like, there is nobody who will ever be exactly like you. There was nobody ever exactly like you. There never will be anybody exactly like you. Like, you were created meticulously, purposefully to be here, to live out a specific purpose that is specific and unique to you, that will never be repeated again. That to me speaks of Allah Ta'ala's immense love for us, an immense mercy for us. Having this idea in our minds that we have this innate self-worth, because Allah says that we were created in the best of molds, that he honored the children of Adam. He honored us. Like, we have this innate worth and dignity and value in the eyes of Allah Ta'ala, and really, what does it matter for anybody else what they think? And this is my favorite slide, but alas, we won't be able to go through it, but just looking into our practices on a deeper level, and the things that also correlate with what science is coming out about healing after trauma, and looking at like the somatic therapy of dhikr, of salah, the co-regulation of our group practices, the mindfulness that's innately in those practices has been really, really exciting for me to be able to do some research. And then I'll close with this idea of prophetic self-care and building resilience. I heard a beautiful definition of resilience, as resilience is not this idea of like, I just have to push through no matter what, even if I'm going on empty, but rather resilience is about how we replenish along the way. How do we pause and replenish and then keep moving? not keep moving despite our empty tank. And we learned this all from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, how he was the model of balance and self-care, and being able to have all of these roles and functions, but be able to still take time for himself and for worship. He did a third of his life, a third of his day for family and for himself, a third of his day for community, and a third for Allah and worshiping. He used to get up in the night and sleep. He used to take an afternoon nap. The way that he emphasized nourishment, he was practically a vegetarian, would eat meat only rarely. I'm losing my vocabulary now. Exercise was a big deal, spending time in nature and solitude, keeping good companionship, and then lastly, his boundaries. One of my favorite stories, and I'll close with this, is that the Prophet ﷺ, we can say that he likely went through trauma seeing his uncle Hamza on the battlefield get mutilated and slaughtered by Wahshi. And when Wahshi came many years later after the conquest of Mecca, and he came to the Prophet ﷺ to seek, he wanted to take the Shahada and become a part of the Muslim Ummah and the community. And the Prophet ﷺ's answer just always stayed with me and struck me, where he says, obviously we embrace you into the fold of the community. You are Muslim, you took the Shahada, but just don't be around me. I don't need to have you physically close to me. And the Prophet, like the one who is full of mercy and compassion and love, still teaches us that we can draw those boundaries, that we can forgive people who have hurt us. But then there's a soft spot there. There's a wound that maybe has just been covered over very slightly, and just seeing that person or being reminded of them will trigger that pain. That there can be that barrier or that boundary there, and so we ask ourselves, what are our bodies, what are our minds, what are our spirits constantly needing to respond to? What are the stimuli that we're putting in front of them, and how can we be really intentional about the things that we surround ourselves with, and be able to put up those boundaries for our emotional well-being. So that is just a sampling. Jazakumullah khairan, and I will turn it back over to Dr.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. I really appreciate both of your contributions. I'm going to spend 2 minutes weaving kind of your talks to the conference, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions and answers. So we brought this Dr. Amin Matthews as a keynote to offer some perspective, and offer a perspective that many of us don't have. And this really relates to Bilal's discussion of eminent theology, in terms of her combining her activism as a Muslim, as a community psychologist in her anti-violence movement. And that's one of and I want to have you keep that in mind and thinking about different perspectives people bring. Zain, we recognize his contributions, his leadership in starting narratives of pain, and he mentioned something when he accepted the award of believe those who are sharing with you. That when he gave the example of, if someone says I'm dehydrated, we don't say no you're not, or this is my favorite musician, we don't say no you're not, no it isn't, we just believe them. But if someone says I'm suffering or I'm down, sometimes we question them. And so Bilal gave that example of that woman who was fighting for a jubab, and what that, in the context of what that meant to her with her history and being in the prison. And one thing, it made me think about, that Bilal kind of gave me pause with, is the risk of intra-ethnic countertransference, which is the fact that we, as Muslim mental health professionals, when Muslims come to us, they might think of us as some sort of religious authority. And we might make unknowingly give them permission or make judgment or not believe or not understand the context. So as an example, back to Bilal's example, that jilbab meant a lot to that woman. In the surface, you might say, well, it's not a fault for you to wear a jilbab. You might have that opinion. But because you judged and you kind of let your counter transfer take the best of you and make a kind of a decision on that. So I wanted to make that link to kind of some of the themes of perspectives of people, what people bring, and just a reminder of that to what Bilal brought. With Sondos, I want to, in terms of what she shared, so Islamic, she really beautifully demonstrated how Islamic chaplains are engaging in Islamic tradition in counseling and thinking, and counseling, psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry are inherently secular enterprises. Conversely, pastoral care counseling, Islamic chaplaincy, is inherently a spiritual enterprise. And so they are integrating the Islamic tradition in their counseling, not just in theory, but also applied. So we tend to look at Islamic psychology as a place to how do we integrate spirituality and our tradition into counseling. But we really should be looking at Islamic chaplains and really partnering and learning from them in terms of how they're doing it. As Sondos demonstrated, we can learn a lot from the Islamic chaplains. And every year we try to improve the conference, and we were deliberate of making sure that we had Islamic chaplains who could share with us this year. And I'm thinking, and I'm going to bring this back to the organizers, that really every year we should have a panel, at least one panel, or integrate Islamic chaplains very intentionally. I mean, we always welcome them. They sometimes submit abstracts. But if they don't, we need to kind of make sure that there's space for them because of what essential role they're playing in integrating the tradition into counseling. And she's demonstrated how much we can learn there. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions and answers. And I'm going to give the mic, so to speak, back to Naila so she can coordinate the questions and answers.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I believe one of the first questions was when Brother Bilal was speaking. Someone said, walking with as opposed to ascending to, are these liberation theology paradigms?
So they can be, but I don't like to categorize things within like a secular framework, because liberation like theology is not devoid or is not it is not absence from the context in which that emerged, that whole like literature. And so I don't want to say that yes, it is like a categorically is a liberation theology. It can be a means of liberation, as Dr. Hamada said, as an integration of theological theory and theological praxis. So both as you're understanding who God is and your relationship to God, and how you practice what God has asked you to do between you and yourself and God and others. And through that integration, there becomes like a liberation. And sometimes in the absence of that integration, you can be you can be locked or bound. And so so that's why that next question too was, isn't sometimes ascending or walking with a means to like ascending too? It could be, but quite often people think that the end goal is the ascension too. But I am reminded of a story of somebody who was knocking or who was making dua for something for many years, and then all of a sudden like a thought or it came to him like, you should stop making this dua, it hasn't been answered. And then it was said to him, to him in a dream or something like, why did you stop knocking at the door when your knocking at the door was the answer? Was you going through the act of knocking, making an effort was your actual answer. So so it can be a both and. It doesn't have to be a this or that.
Okay, for both presenters, someone's asking, can they get a copy of the slides or emails for both of you? Which I think contact information you can also get through the web app. If anyone else has any questions, they can put them in the chat.
Okay, I'll keep it going. So let me ask you, Bilal and Sondos, what's your experience working with mental health professionals, or either in general or Muslim mental health professionals? Good, bad, ugly, just experience in general. If you don't have any experience, then you can share that too.
I mean, you know, again, like, you know, you can't paint people with broad brushes. It's not like monolith. Lithic group. I really enjoyed my like partnership with them, whether we were in whether in the prison, whether in a hospital or on a military base. Most of my referrals actually came from mental health professionals, and so I really appreciated the like partnership, and so yeah, I don't want a broad brush. Some, you know, right, right now at the college that I work with, work at, I am working with the whole mental health like department, helping them through, helping them like navigate or like relations with them, better relationships within themselves as an office, and so so the ability of using pastoral skills for a whole office of mental health like professionals who have the Ph.D, with the doctors, with the psychiatrists, but helping them create community, healthy like relations, is what I'm is what I'm actively doing, you know, now. So it all depends.
For me, I'd say that practically speaking, how I utilize mental health professionals is that I'm usually making the referrals out. So my expertise, as we want to call it, is, goes up until a certain point, and then I need to hand that over to somebody who can really take on the client long term, be able to really delve deeper into, their experiences in the past and whatnot, in ways and tools that I'm just not trained in, and I recognize that. So being able to also assess and refer out is something that we are educated in and that we utilize and do. And so I've been really grateful for especially the Muslim mental health professionals that I have access to here locally, that I'm constantly referring people out to and making these connections. On a personal level, I'm very grateful for them because they have walked alongside me. I think they're saying like every therapist needs a therapist or every chaplain needs a chaplain. Alhamdulillah that we have people who can offer those talents and those gifts, and I've been very, very grateful for that for myself. And then if we want to think like theoretically, Dr. Hamada, I completely agree with what you were saying earlier, that there should be more of a partnership, more conversation around this idea of well-being and wellness and holistic care between chaplains and mental health professionals. Very rarely do we find Muslim chaplains at the table, so to speak, of these conversations. And so this is why, this is really a breath of fresh air, and I really applaud the organizers for putting some thought into inviting us into that space, because really we have these discussions all the time. We write about them, we reflect about it, we read about it, and we're really doing the work. And so we want to be able to find that overlap and not recreate the wheel in our own little silos. But really, there's a beautiful relationship that can come about. Inshallah.
And so I think that, we have like we have like Sondos, who is very Sondos is an active member of the Association of Muslim like chaplains. She's on the executive board. I don't know where exactly she sits, but I'm an advisor to that. So I think there should be a partnership, a intentional partnership between M.P.H and also the AMC, where we share resources. We we need to be more intentional about this relationship. The Dr. Hamada and I have been back and forth over this for years. But Dr. Hamada, you should see the AMC now. It is soaring. The level of like professionals that are there. There's over 200 like members. It is really. The conference this year was amazing. So they're doing some really good things. So I think a partnership between us would be great.
Absolutely, looking forward to it. I think there's some other questions coming in.
Yeah, so for Sister Sondos, somebody asked, there's a hadith of mourning being 3 days. So what is the 3 days referring to in regards to like mourning and emotions?
To be honest, I don't remember. I would have to probably read up on that a little bit. Chaplain Bilal, do you know the specific reason, or Dr. Hamada, for the 3 days of mourning? Other than generally just having some kind of limit to that.
Yeah, be careful about that. Our sciences of narrations are weighted upon Rijal, the ilm of Rijal, so the chain of Sanad, but also of Matan, the text. And so be careful of applying things haphazardly. It's difference between a pharmacist and a doctor. Like, you don't just go and grab medicine off the shelf. You need a pharmacist to know, to give you the right things and to give you the right medicine. But that the doctor knows which medicine to choose for which problem. So be very, very careful, because we are neither the pharmacist nor the doctor. So be careful with using hadith that way.
And that's great advice. Other questions, comments, compliments?
We said great advice. Other people are saying.
Just want to say that I want to give a shout out to like Sondos. She just became BCCI like certified, and just so you know what that is a rigorous level of, and so they're looking for 4 areas, and the first area of what the BCCI looks for. So the board like chaplaincy, like certification, is they look for the integration of theory and praxis in 6 areas. And then they look for how your professional identity and like conduct is shaped, by that integration. And then they look for your professional like practice skills and abilities. And then they look for how you are within the institution as an organizational like leader. So these are the 4 areas that she just went through this rigorous like process. So I as a chaplain, I'm very, very proud of Sondos becoming BCCI.
Jazakallah khair, Chaplain. That means a lot. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit, in the way of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, I cried at that committee when they gave me that news. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
Mabruk, very proud of you, Sondos. You guys are really doing excellent. You guys are really doing excellent work. Look, I'm a therapist too. I'm comfortable with awkward silences, so it's up to you guys. We could keep it going. We've ended quickly. It's the end of the day. We can give you guys a little break before our closing remarks. In what opens?
One more question, if that's okay, and then if no more, then we can wrap it up.
Okay.
On emotions, can we say that emotions are coming from Allah, since we are often not in control of how we are reacting?
Never thought of it that way. I look at emotions as a gift. And like I opened with in my presentation, it really is this God. Well, I guess I put it in my comments and didn't even intentionally think about it. It's a God-given internal security system, where when an emotion rises, it's again alerting us that something is off. that we need to take pause and we need to assess what is going on internally, whether it's that mind, body, or spirit. So just like when we are wounded or there's something happening to our bodies, a pain that we can locate, right? Then they go and they do an assessment and an intervention. Emotions are pretty much the same way, and that's where I tied it to Muraqaba Muhasaba. That's our assessment and figuring out the intervention of what needs to happen in order to protect that part that's alerting us that something is off, that there is a threat. And we are not in control of how we are reacting. I would say that all of these, the Quranic injunctions and the prophetic recommendations for patients suggest that we can be in control of how we are reacting. That the emotions, maybe we don't have control over, but our reaction to them we do. And that we have this intentionality, this mindfulness that's built into our tradition where we are training. Actually, I look at Salah 5 times a day as our daily training exercise in this discipline of hudud and mindfulness and being in our body and having our heart be where our feet are at. Like when we talk about that hudud, it's a struggle to be able to do that. That's the training that we're in. Imagine if we can accomplish that 5 times a day. Where can we be when these emotions come up for us? Can we do the same thing? Can we take that pause for a few minutes and really turn to people? I'll let Dr. Hamada and Chaplain Bilal answer.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Just a quick question. This is Saira Qureshi. Just wanted to ask if there are some theological cross-cultural models that you might be aware of, so that I work with college students and young adults, teenagers from Muslim families as well as non-Muslim families. And oftentimes when youth have a sort of a weaker or not as clear, I don't want to put labels like moderate or not moderate, a sense of religiosity, then it is hard for them to understand that risky behaviors are risky behaviors for X, Y, or Z reasons, or whatever it is that they're struggling with in the context of integration, assimilation, or acculturation, especially if they are not born in the country. And then also for those who are born in the country now, it is harder for them to understand that there are some spaces, some activities where they perhaps might have the mental health issues coming up because they are having a dissonance or a conflict between their religious, not in an orthodox context, but definitely at least as a sincerely practicing young Muslims, where parents do want them to be more, trained or staying with positive peer influence, but kids or young teenagers get pulled in the other direction. Any cross-cultural sort of a theological model that you can please make us aware of, so that perhaps I can look it up and read more on it. And when I talk to my own boss, actually, she's a BMC psychologist, but she was trained at Temple. She's from Bahamas, and she is a pastoral counselor. And oftentimes I have a very good heart-to-heart conversation with her, that if I were to do some Islamic psychology, she always encourages me, Sarah, you should do more of the marketing with your own community so that you can see more of the people that you are working with, and inform me and the rest of our colleagues too about doing a presentation. Exactly what is it that the parents of Muslim children are looking? What is it that so I created a survey, and I'd be happy to share it with you later on by sending. And I really want that if we can partner with our non-Muslim pastoral chaplains as well as therapists in my field, then perhaps we'll have a better equipped position to tackle the issues that youth are facing. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll start. So I'm not sure about theological, cross-cultural theological resource. However, I think a really good resource for the kind of questions you're asking is Samir Ahmed and Mona Amer's textbook on counseling Muslims. It addresses kind of these cultural issues across different populations in the American Muslim community. So that would be both good for Muslims as well as non-Muslim providers who are counseling Muslims. So I'd recommend that. Of course, I would make a shameless plug for the Institute and become a member of the Institute of Muslim Mental Health, because that's where we exchange more resources. These are ongoing issues. It's not one book will resolve it. These are ongoing issues, and we share resources and share thoughts and so forth and so on. But the Sondos or Bilal, any other recommendations for resources?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's when you're taking a pastoral approach, you very rarely give consultative like advice, because you're not the shepherd of that flock. And there's so many different variables that need to be, weighed in. Families, systems need to be examined. What's the a lot of things that need to be examined. What is the Islamic creedal impact on one's like psychological like well-being? What is the Islamic legal impact? All these things are measured before I'm able to give pastoral like advice. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Looks like as of right now, that's all the questions we have. So.
Okay, thank you again, everybody, for hanging in there towards the end of the conference and the last day. We do have kind of closing remarks at, I think, 4:45, and hope to see you there. Sondos and Bilal, as always, a pleasure. Look forward to continuing to work together, hang out, and so forth and so on. Assalamu alaikum.